The fire should have killed him, but it was the man who came after that changed everything. I remember how the night smelled like rain and gasoline, how my hands trembled on the steering wheel after a 16-hour shift, every muscle in my body begging for sleep. The street was empty, just flickering streetlights and the low hum of distant traffic, until the sound shattered everything. A sharp crack, then a bloom of orange light in my rearview mirror. I slammed the brakes without thinking, heart slamming against my ribs as I turned and saw the car, flames licking up its sides, smoke curling into the sky like a warning I should have ignored. People always say you have a choice in moments like that you weigh the risk, think about consequences, but that's not true. I didn't think, I just moved. My sneakers hit the pavement before I even realized I'd opened the door, heat rushing toward me in waves that made my skin prickle, the air thick and hard to breathe. Someone was shouting somewhere behind me, telling me to stay back, but all I could hear was a sound that didn't belong to the fire. A child crying, small and terrified. I ran faster, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to wait for help, to be smart for once in my life. But I'd never been good at walking away when someone needed me. The closer I got, the louder the crackling became, the glow reflecting off the asphalt like liquid gold, and through the haze I saw him, a little boy, maybe 4 years old, strapped into the back seat, his tiny hands pressed against the window as if he could push the fear away. My breath caught, panic clawing up my throat, but I forced it down, forced my hands to move as I reached for the door handle, praying it would open. It resisted for half a second that felt like forever, then gave with a jolt that nearly threw me off balance. The heat surged, wrapping around me, but I leaned in anyway, my arms reaching for him, fingers fumbling with the buckle until it finally clicked. "It's okay," I whispered, though my voice shook. "I've got you." And I pulled him close, shielding his face as I turned away from the fire, every step back feeling heavier than the last. When we reached the curb, I dropped to my knees, clutching him as he cried against my shoulder, my own breath coming in uneven gasps as the world seemed to tilt. Sirens wailed in the distance now, growing louder, closer, but something else cut through the chaos, a silence that didn't belong. I felt it before I saw him, the shift in the air, the way the noise around us seemed to fade. When I looked up, he was already there, standing a few feet away like he'd stepped out of the darkness itself, tall, composed, his black suit untouched by the smoke, his eyes fixed on the child in my arms, and then on me. There was no panic in his expression, no relief the way you'd expect from a parent, just something colder, sharper, like he was assessing a situation instead of reacting to it. My grip tightened instinctively around the boy as those eyes met mine, and for a second, everything else disappeared. The sirens, the fire, the people gathering at a distance. It was just him and me, and the weight of something I couldn't explain settling over my chest. "You saved my son," he said finally, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard. I opened my mouth, not even sure what I was going to say, but the words never came, because he took a step closer, and the look in his eyes changed, not softer, not warmer, just certain. "That means something now," he added, and I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. But the way my pulse quickened told me I should have been afraid. Because in that moment, kneeling on cold pavement with a stranger's child in my arms, I realized the fire wasn't the most dangerous thing I had just walked into. I should have walked away the moment he said that, should have handed the boy to the paramedics and disappeared into the night like none of it had anything to do with me. But my legs would not move and my hands stayed wrapped around the child, as if letting go would mean stepping into something I could not escape. The boy clung to me, his small fingers gripping my jacket, his breathing uneven but steady enough to tell me he was going to be okay. And I focused on that because it was easier than looking at the man standing in front of me. "He needs to be checked." I managed, my voice quieter than I expected, the words coming out more like a reminder to myself than a request. And finally something shifted in his expression, not warmth, not exactly concern, but acknowledgement. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the faint lines near his eyes, the kind that did not come from smiling, but from years of watching everything and trusting nothing. And when he reached out, it was not to take the boy from me immediately. It was slower than that, deliberate, like he was measuring the distance between us before closing it. "Leo," he said softly, and the child in my arms stilled just enough to look at him. And that was when I understood, not from the word itself but from the way it was said, this was not just any man. This was someone who was used to being heard, to being obeyed. Even in the quietest moments, I let him take the boy then, carefully, my arms. Suddenly feeling empty and too light, like I had been holding on to something that grounded me, and now it was gone. The paramedics arrived seconds later, voices overlapping, equipment moving, questions being asked, but everything blurred at the edges because my attention kept drifting back to him. He did not step aside the way most people would, did not raise his voice or demand answers. He simply stood there, holding his son, and the world seemed to organize itself around him as if it understood something I did not. Someone tried to guide me away, asking if I was hurt, if I needed to sit down, but I shook my head, my gaze still fixed on him as he finally looked back at me. Really looked this time, not just seeing me but studying me in a way that made my chest tighten. "What is your name?" he asked, not unkindly, but not casually either, like the answer mattered more than it should have. "Emily," I said, and I hated how small my voice sounded, how it did not match the steady rhythm I was trying to force into my heartbeat. He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself, then glanced toward the ambulance where his son was being taken, and for a second, just a second, something human flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like relief, before it disappeared behind that controlled mask again. "Emily," he repeated, and the way he said it made it feel less like a name and more like a decision, and I felt it settle somewhere deep in my chest, heavy and uninvited. "You did something tonight that cannot be ignored," he continued, his voice low enough that no one else seemed to hear, and I wanted to tell him that it was nothing, that anyone would have done the same. But the word stuck because we both knew that was not true. I took a step back instead, instinct kicking in, the part of me that recognized danger even when it wore a calm face. But he noticed, of course he noticed, and something in his gaze sharpened, not angry, not offended, just aware. "I did not do it for you," I said quickly, needing to draw a line before I even understood where it needed to be. "I did it because he needed help." And for the first time, his lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to change the air between us. "That is exactly why it matters," he replied, and before I could respond, before I could figure out what that meant, someone called his name from behind, a man in a dark coat speaking urgently, and he turned just enough to acknowledge him, but not enough to break that invisible thread that had formed between us. When he looked back at me, it was different now, more certain, more final, like whatever decision he had made was already set in motion. "Go home, Emily," he said, and the words should have felt like freedom, like a release, but they did not when he added quietly, "We will speak again." And I knew, standing there under flashing lights with the smell of smoke still clinging to my clothes, that this was not over, not even close. I told myself it was over the moment I walked away, that whatever had just happened would stay in that street, swallowed by sirens and flashing lights. But the silence that followed me home felt too heavy, like something unseen had decided to come with me. My apartment was exactly how I left it, small, quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound as I kicked off my shoes and leaned against the door, trying to slow my breathing, trying to convince myself that I was safe here, that I was just Emily again, not the girl who ran into a burning car and caught the attention of a man who looked at people like they were part of a calculation. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes I saw the fire, felt the heat, and then those eyes, steady and unreadable, watching me like I was something he had already claimed. By morning, exhaustion settled into my bones, the kind that coffee could not fix, but routine was easier than thinking. So I got dressed, grabbed my bag, and headed to the hospital like nothing had changed, except everything had. It started small, almost subtle, the kind of thing you could ignore if you wanted to. The parking ticket I had been dreading was gone, not reduced, not delayed, just gone, like it had never existed. Then the front desk greeted me by name with a warmth that felt unfamiliar, like they had been told to notice me. I brushed it off, told myself I was imagining patterns where there were none, until my supervisor called me into her office halfway through my shift. I expected a warning for leaving early the night before, maybe a lecture about responsibility, but instead she smiled, actually smiled, and told me my schedule had been adjusted, fewer overnight shifts, better hours. Something about recognizing hard work and dedication. I stared at her, confused, because nothing like that had ever happened before, not without a reason, not without a request attached. Is there anything else? I asked carefully, waiting for the catch, but she just shook her head, like it was the most normal thing in the world. It was not. By the time I stepped outside that evening, the air felt different, like the world had shifted slightly out of place, and I could not tell if I was the only one who noticed. That was when I saw the car, black, parked across the street, engine off. Windows tinted just enough to hide whoever was inside, but not enough to pretend it was not watching. My steps slowed without meaning to, every instinct telling me to turn around, to go back inside, to disappear into the safety of fluorescent lights and crowded hallways. But something held me there, something stubborn and unwilling to run. The door opened before I could decide, smooth and quiet, and one of the men stepped out, dressed in a dark suit that fit too perfectly to be ordinary. He did not look threatening, not in the obvious way, but there was a precision to his movements that made it clear he was not there by accident. "Miss Carter," he said, polite, almost respectful, and that was what made it worse, because respect implied intention, and intention meant this was planned. My chest tightened as I took a step back, my voice steadier than I felt. "I do not know you." And he inclined his head slightly, as if he expected that answer. "Mr. Volkov asked me to make sure you got home safely," he replied, and the words should have sounded reassuring, but they did not. Not when they confirmed exactly what I had been trying not to believe. This was not a coincidence, not a one-time encounter. This was something else, something already set in motion. I glanced past him at the car, at the shadowed interior, half expecting to see those familiar eyes watching me again. But there was nothing, just darkness and the reflection of streetlights. "I do not need an escort," I said, forcing the words out, drawing a line even as my pulse quickened. But he did not argue, did not insist, just opened the rear door slightly and waited, like the choice had already been made, and he was simply giving me the illusion of deciding. And that was when it hit me, not as fear, not exactly, but as understanding, quiet and unavoidable. Walking away had not ended anything. It had only been the beginning. I should have said no, should have turned around and walked the other way. But there was something in the way he stood there, patient and unmoving, that made it feel like refusing would not actually change anything. My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag as I looked past him again, half expecting the car to disappear if I ignored it long enough. But it stayed exactly where it was, quiet and waiting, like it belonged there more than I did. "I can get home on my own," I repeated firmer. This time, trying to hold on to whatever control I still had. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought he might step aside, might let me walk past and prove that this was all in my head. Instead, he gave a small nod, almost respectful, but did not move away from the door he was holding open. "Of course," he said calmly, "but he prefers certainty." And the way he said it made my stomach tighten, because it was not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. I exhaled slowly, forcing my thoughts to settle, telling myself that getting into a car was not surrender, that it was just a ride, just a way to end the strange tension that had followed me all day. But even as I stepped forward, I knew that was not entirely true. The interior was quieter than I expected, soft leather, faint scent of something expensive and understated, nothing out of place, nothing that gave away anything about the person who owned it, except for the sense that everything had been chosen carefully. The door closed behind me with a muted click, sealing out the noise of the street. And for a second, I considered asking where we were going, considered demanding answers. But the words stayed in my throat as the car began to move smoothly into traffic. I watched the city pass by through the tinted window, familiar streets suddenly feeling distant, like I was being pulled into something I could not see yet. No one spoke, not the driver, not the man in the front seat, and the silence stretched just long enough to make me aware of every small detail, the rhythm of my heartbeat, the way my hands rested too still in my lap, the quiet realization that I had crossed a line without fully understanding it. When the car finally slowed, I expected my building, the cracked sidewalk and flickering light that marked home, but instead we stopped in front of a place I did not recognize, something larger, cleaner, the kind of building that did not exist in my part of the city. Confusion pushed past my caution as I leaned forward slightly. "This is not my apartment," I said, and the man in the front seat turned just enough for me to see the edge of his profile. Calm, composed, like nothing about this required explanation. "It is not meant to be," he replied simply, and before I could respond, the door opened again. This time, I hesitated, my instincts finally catching up, warning me that stepping out would mean stepping further into whatever this was. But staying inside did not feel like an option either. The air outside was cooler, quieter, the city noise reduced to a distant hum, and as I stood there, unsure of what came next, I felt it again, that shift in the atmosphere, the subtle change that told me I was not alone. I turned slowly, already knowing who I would see before my eyes confirmed it. He stood a few steps away, exactly as I remembered, composed, watchful, like he had been there the entire time and the rest of us were just catching up. My breath caught, not from fear alone but from the certainty that this was deliberate, every moment of the past 24 hours leading here. "You said I should go home," I said, the words coming out steadier than I felt, because I needed something to hold on to, some piece of logic in a situation that refused to follow any. His gaze held mine, unflinching, as he stepped closer, not invading, not rushing, just closing the distance with quiet intention. "And you did," he replied, his voice low, controlled. "Just not to the place you thought." And that was when I understood, not fully, not completely, but enough to feel the ground shift beneath me. This was never about where I lived. It was about where I belonged now, and whether I accepted it or not. He had already decided. I should have been afraid, the kind of fear that makes you step back and refuse to go any further. But what I felt instead was something quieter, something more dangerous, like the moment right before a storm breaks when the air goes still and heavy and you know there is no stopping what comes next. I crossed my arms instinctively, grounding myself in the only control I had left, and met his gaze without looking away, even though everything in me warned that he was not someone you challenged lightly. "I do not belong anywhere except where I choose," I said, the words sharper than I expected, cutting through the silence between us, and for a second, I thought I saw something shift in his expression, not anger, not surprise, but interest. He studied me the way he had before, like I was something unexpected, something that did not fit neatly into whatever system he was used to controlling. "Choice," he repeated slowly, as if testing the word, then glanced briefly toward the building behind me before returning his attention to me. "Is a luxury most people misunderstand." I frowned, the meaning settling uneasily in my chest as I took a small step back, refusing to let the space between us close any further. "Then you misunderstand me," I replied, holding on to that defiance even as my pulse quickened. For a moment, neither of us moved, the city noise distant and irrelevant, the world narrowing to this strange standoff where nothing was loud but everything felt significant. Then, unexpectedly, he exhaled, a quiet breath that softened something almost imperceptible in his posture, and he stepped aside, not far, but enough to shift the balance, enough to make it clear he was not going to force me forward. "Come," he said, not a command this time, not entirely, but not a request either, something in between that made refusing feel like ignoring a truth rather than defying a man. I hesitated, my instincts still tangled between leaving and staying, but curiosity, that stubborn part of me that had run into fire without thinking, pushed me forward again. Inside, the building was as controlled as everything else about him, clean lines, quiet lighting, the kind of place where nothing was out of place and nothing happened by accident. My footsteps echoed softly against the polished floor as I followed him, aware of how out of place I must look, still carrying the weight of a life that did not belong in spaces like this. He did not look back to check if I was following, did not slow his pace, as if he already knew I would be there. And that certainty unsettled me more than anything else. We stopped in front of a door that opened before he even reached for it, someone inside stepping aside without a word, and I caught a glimpse of a room that felt warmer than the rest, softer, something almost normal hidden within all this precision. "You should see him," he said quietly, and that was the first time his voice carried something different, not control, not calculation, but something closer to honesty. My breath caught as I realized what he meant, who he meant, and suddenly the distance between the fire and this moment collapsed into something immediate. "He is okay," I said, more to reassure myself than him, but he nodded once, as if he had already confirmed that, as if facts like that were never left uncertain in his world. "He asked about you," he added, and that simple sentence hit harder than anything else he had said, because it pulled me back to the only part of this that made sense, the reason I had run into the fire in the first place. I stepped forward without thinking, drawn by something that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the small boy I had pulled from danger. But as I crossed the threshold, I felt it again. That invisible line, the one I kept stepping over without realizing it. And this time, I knew it was not just about him anymore. It was about the fact that every step I took deeper into this world made it harder to find my way back out. The room felt different the moment I stepped inside, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with intention. Like even the air had been arranged to keep things calm, controlled, safe. Leo sat on the bed, smaller than I remembered, wrapped in a soft blanket that made him look like any other child instead of the boy I had pulled out of chaos just hours ago. And when his eyes found mine, something in my chest eased for the first time since that night began. "You came back," he said, his voice still fragile but steady enough to carry across the room, and I felt a faint smile form before I could stop it, because that simple sentence grounded everything, pulled me away from the weight of the man standing behind me and back into something real. "I told you I would make sure you were okay," I replied gently, stepping closer, my focus narrowing to him, to the small details that made sense. The way his fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. The way his breathing had evened out. I sat beside him carefully, aware of every movement, as if anything too sudden might break the fragile calm that had settled here. "It was loud," he said after a moment, his eyes drifting slightly, not fully meeting mine, and I understood what he meant without him needing to explain. "I know," I whispered, keeping my voice soft, steady, the way I had learned to speak to patients when they needed something more than just words. "But you are safe now." He nodded slowly, as if trying to believe it, and then his gaze shifted past me, toward the doorway, toward the presence that had not moved since we entered. I did not need to turn to know he was still there, watching, always watching. "He does that," Leo added quietly, and I frowned slightly, glancing back just enough to catch Adrian standing exactly where I expected, composed, unreadable, like the entire moment was something he was observing rather than part of. "Does what?" I asked, turning back to Leo, even though I already felt the answer forming somewhere in the back of my mind. "He watches," Leo said simply, and there was no fear in his voice, just acceptance, the kind that comes from knowing something has always been that way. I swallowed, the words settling heavier than they should have, because they confirmed what I had been trying not to fully acknowledge, that this was not temporary, not a coincidence. This was his world, and I had stepped into it. I stayed a little longer than I planned, talking to Leo, asking simple questions, letting the conversation drift into something light, something normal, and each second made it easier to forget where I was, easier to pretend that this was just another room, another patient, another moment that would end when I walked out the door. But the moment I stood up, the weight returned, subtle but undeniable, like a reminder that nothing here existed without purpose. I turned, finally facing Adrian fully, and for a second, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional. "He is stable," I said, defaulting to what I knew, to something clinical, something safe. Even though he had not asked, he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the information as if it had always been expected. "He trusts you," he said instead, his voice low, measured, and I felt something tighten in my chest because that mattered more than it should have. "He is a child," I replied, more defensive than I intended. "He trusts easily." Adrian's gaze did not waver, did not soften, but there was a shift there, something almost thoughtful. "No," he said quietly, "he does not." And the certainty in his tone left no room for argument, no space to dismiss what he was implying. I hesitated, the edge of something unfamiliar pressing in, something that felt dangerously close to understanding, and I forced myself to step back, creating distance, drawing a line I was not sure I could maintain. "I should go," I said, because staying felt like a mistake I would not be able to undo. And for a moment, I expected him to stop me, to remind me of whatever claim he believed he had. But he did not move, did not block the door, did not say anything at all. Instead, he simply watched me, that same steady gaze following every step as I walked toward the exit. And just as my hand reached the door, his voice cut through the silence again, quiet but impossible to ignore. "Emily," he said, and I paused, my breath catching despite myself. "This does not end when you leave." And I knew, without turning around, without needing to see his expression, that he was not making a threat, he was stating a fact. And somehow, that was worse. I did not look back when I walked out, not because I was not tempted, but because I knew if I did, I would hesitate, and hesitation felt like the first step towards something I could not control. The hallway seemed longer on the way out, quieter, every footstep echoing just enough to remind me that I was leaving something behind, something that had already begun to change the way I thought, the way I felt, the way I moved through the world. By the time I reached the street, the air felt colder, sharper against my skin, and I inhaled deeply, as if I could reset everything with one breath, as if I could step back into the life I had before that night. But the city did not feel the same, not anymore. The lights were brighter, the shadows deeper, every passing car catching my attention in a way it never had before, like I was suddenly aware of things I used to ignore. I told myself it was just exhaustion, just the aftermath of a long shift and too much adrenaline. But the feeling stayed with me all the way home, quiet and persistent. My apartment greeted me with the same stillness as before, but it no longer felt like a place untouched by everything else. It felt like a space that had not yet caught up. I set my bag down, moved through the motions of normal life, turning on lights, pouring a glass of water, trying to anchor myself in routine. But my mind kept circling back, replaying every moment, every word, every look. "This does not end when you leave." His voice echoed in my thoughts, not loud, not threatening, just certain, and that certainty unsettled me more than anything else. I barely slept again, my dreams filled with fragments I could not fully piece together, firelight and shadows, a child's voice and a man's steady gaze. Morning came too quickly, and with it, the quiet determination to prove that I still had control over my own life. I dressed carefully, choosing familiarity over anything else, and stepped outside with a sense of purpose I hoped would carry me through the day. The walk to work felt longer, every step measured, every glance over my shoulder unintentional but impossible to stop. Nothing happened, no cars following, no figures watching, just the ordinary rhythm of the city moving around me as if nothing had changed. And yet, when I reached the hospital, the shift in atmosphere was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, like a current running just beneath the surface. Conversations lowered as I passed, not silent, not obvious, but enough to make me notice. A nurse I barely knew greeted me with a warmth that felt rehearsed, and I forced a polite smile in return, telling myself I was imagining things. Again, I focused on my work, on the steady routine of patients and charts and procedures, anything that kept my mind occupied, anything that felt real and predictable. Hours passed, and slowly, the tension in my shoulders eased, the sense of being watched fading into something distant, something I could almost ignore. I let myself believe, just for a moment, that maybe he had meant something else, that maybe his words were not as final as they had sounded, until the message arrived. It was not dramatic, not urgent, just a simple envelope left at the nurse's station with my name written neatly across the front, as if it belonged there, as if it had always been part of my day. My hands stilled as I picked it up, the paper heavier than it should have been, the air around me suddenly too quiet again. I did not need to open it to know who it was from, did not need confirmation to feel the shift settle back into place. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tracing the edge of the envelope as I realized something I had been trying to avoid since the moment I stepped out of that building. Leaving had not created distance. It had only given him time to reach me in a different way. My fingers lingered on the envelope longer than they should have, like touching it might somehow confirm what I was not ready to admit, but the weight of it in my hand was already enough. I glanced around the nurse's station, half expecting someone to be watching, to be waiting for my reaction. But everything looked normal, too normal. Conversations continuing, monitors beeping. Life moving forward like this was just another piece of paper in an ordinary day. It was not. I slipped it into my pocket instead of opening it right away, telling myself I would deal with it later, that I would not let him dictate the rhythm of my life. Even as a quiet part of me knew that he already had. The rest of my shift passed in fragments, my focus slipping at the edges, every task taking more effort than it should have, every moment stretched thin by the awareness of what waited just out of sight. By the time I finally stepped outside, the sky had shifted into that deep blue that comes just before night fully settles, the air cooler, calmer, and for a brief second, I let myself breathe, let myself believe that I could still choose how this unfolded. I reached into my pocket slowly, pulling the envelope out with a steady hand, and for a moment, I just looked at it, at the clean lines of my name written across the front, precise and deliberate, like everything else connected to him. I opened it carefully, the paper inside unfolding without resistance, and my eyes scanned the words, simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. An address, a time, nothing more. No explanation, no request, just expectation. My chest tightened as I read it again, as if the meaning might change the second time. But it did not. It was not an invitation. It was a continuation. I folded the paper back along the same crease, slower this time, my thoughts racing ahead of me, trying to calculate what this meant. What would happen if I ignored it, if I chose not to go? The answer came too easily, not as fear, but as certainty, the kind that settles in your bones when you know you are already part of something whether you agreed to it or not. I started walking, my steps automatic, the city moving around me in familiar patterns that felt distant now, like I was watching it from somewhere just outside myself. Every streetlight, every passing car, every shadow felt sharper, more defined, as if I was seeing everything through a lens I could not turn off. I told myself I would not go, that I would go home, lock the door, pretend this was nothing more than a strange encounter that would fade with time. But my feet slowed as I reached the corner, hesitation creeping in where certainty used to be. I stopped, exhaling slowly, my grip tightening around the folded paper, and that was when I noticed it, the subtle shift in the air, the quiet awareness that I was not alone. I did not turn immediately, did not need to, because I could feel it, the same presence that had followed me since the fire, steady and unrelenting. When I finally looked across the street, the car was already there, parked in plain sight. No attempt to hide, no need to. I stared at it for a long second, my pulse quickening, not from surprise, but from the confirmation of something I had been trying to deny. This was not about whether I would go. It was about how long I would pretend I had a choice. I inhaled deeply, the city. Noise fading into the background as I made a decision that felt less like a decision and more like stepping into something that had already been waiting for me. I crossed the street slowly, every step deliberate, every doubt still present, but no longer strong enough to stop me. And as I reached for the door handle, I realized something that settled heavier than anything else so far. This was not the moment I lost control. It was the moment I understood I had been holding on to it for longer than I should have, and letting go might be the only way to survive what came next. I did not hesitate this time when I opened the door, because hesitation had already cost me the illusion of control, and stepping inside felt like accepting something I had been circling since the night of the fire. The door closed behind me with that same quiet finality, and the car moved before I could second-guess myself, the city lights sliding past the window like fragments of a life I was already drifting away from. No one spoke, but the silence felt different now, less uncertain, more settled, like a decision had been made and everyone in the car understood it except me. I leaned back slightly, forcing my breathing to stay even, reminding myself that I was still choosing this, that I could still walk away at any moment, even though a quiet voice in the back of my mind questioned whether that was still true. When the car finally stopped, I recognized the building this time, the same place I had left, but it felt different now, less unfamiliar, more like something I had already stepped into whether I admitted it or not. I followed without being asked, my steps steady, my thoughts quieter than before, not because I had answers, but because I was starting to understand the shape of the questions. He was waiting in the same place, as if time had not moved at all since I left. His presence unchanged, controlled, deliberate. His eyes met mine immediately, and for a moment, everything else faded again. The hallway, the distant sounds, the space between us shrinking into something that felt both inevitable and dangerous. "You came," he said, not surprised, not questioning, just acknowledging what he had already expected. I crossed my arms lightly, holding on to the last pieces of resistance I could find. "You knew I would," I replied, and his expression shifted just enough to suggest approval, not of obedience, but of understanding. He stepped closer, not invading, but enough to make his presence undeniable, and for the first time, I did not step back. "I needed to be certain," he said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made me pause, something that was not about control, but about something deeper, something I was not ready to name. "Certain of what?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tension building in my chest. His gaze did not waver, did not soften, but there was a clarity there now, something direct and unhidden. "That you would choose to stay when you understood what leaving would mean," he replied, and the words settled heavily, not as a threat, but as a truth I had been avoiding. I exhaled slowly, my mind catching up to the moment, to the realization that this had never been about forcing me. It had been about waiting for me to see what he already had. "And if I do not stay?" I challenged, even though the question felt different now, less defiant, more like testing the edges of something I was already stepping into. For a second, the silence stretched again, but this time it felt intentional, measured, like he was choosing his answer carefully. "Then I will let you go," he said finally, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because it was not what I expected, not what I had prepared myself to hear. I searched his expression for any sign of deception, any hint that this was another layer of control, but there was none, just that same steady certainty that had followed him since the beginning. "But you will not," he added quietly, and something in my chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition, because a part of me already knew he was right. I looked away for a moment, gathering my thoughts, feeling the weight of everything that had led here. The fire, the child, the choices that did not feel like choices at all. When I looked back at him, the space between us felt different, not smaller, not larger, just clearer. "You think you understand me," I said softly, and his response came without hesitation. "No," he said, "I am beginning to." And for the first time, the tension between us shifted into something else, something quieter, something that did not feel like a trap, but did not feel like freedom either. It felt like the start of something I could not define yet, something that would not be easy, and definitely not safe in the way I understood safety, but something I was already too far inside to pretend I could ignore. And standing there, facing him without stepping back, I realized the most dangerous part was not that he had pulled me into his world. It was that somewhere along the way, I had stopped trying to leave.